Before we begin, a quick word. A huge thank you to Rob for sending in this story idea. If you are enjoying what we do here, please take 10 seconds right now and leave us a review on Spotify. Seriously, 10 seconds, a few tapped stars, and it helps this channel more than you could imagine. It helps new listeners find us in the dark, and tonight the dark is exactly where we are going. Welcome back to Sleep Theories. Find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow, and when you are ready, follow me down. It is October of 1997. Somewhere across America, millions of radios glow in the dark. Bedside tables, truck cabs idling in rest stops, kitchen counters in farmhouses where the nearest neighbour is 3 miles away. The voices come through faint and crackling, carried on AM frequencies that seem to travel farther at night, a phenomenon called skywave propagation, where long-wave signals bounce off the ionosphere and reach places no FM signal ever could. The voice they are listening to belongs to Art Bell. Arthur William Bell III was born on June 17, 1945 in Jacksonville, North Carolina. By the late 1990s, he had built something unlike anything else on the American airwaves, a nightly radio program called Coast to Coast AM, broadcast from a small studio inside his home in Pahrump, Nevada, a desert town roughly 60 miles west of Las Vegas. The show ran from midnight until 5 or 6 in the morning. It covered topics most broadcasters would not touch: alien abductions, government black sites, time travel, shadow people, interdimensional contact, and the slow, creeping feeling that the world was stranger than anyone in a position of authority was willing to admit. Art Bell did not laugh at his callers. That was the thing. He listened. He asked follow-up questions. He treated the extraordinary with the same measured, almost bureaucratic seriousness that a news anchor might apply to a Senate hearing. And because of that, because he made the strange feel credible simply by engaging with it calmly, Coast to Coast AM became one of the most listened to overnight radio programs in the history of American broadcasting, reaching an estimated 15 million listeners per week at its peak. On this particular night in October of 1997, the phone lines are open. Strange callers come through every night. They talk about lights in the sky above their homes. They describe men in dark suits who showed up after they reported a sighting. They claim to have worked in facilities that do not appear on any government map. Bell receives them all with the same unhurried patience. But then a man calls who sounds different from the rest. He is not frantic. He's not whispering conspiratorially or speaking too fast the way people do when they are afraid they will be cut off. His voice is steady and quiet, the voice of someone who has had time to sit with what he is about to say and has decided, after considerable deliberation, to say it anyway. He tells Art Bell that he owns land. Land in the desert. Remote land. Land far enough from any town that on a clear night the only sound is wind moving through dry brush, and the occasional low moan of a passing freight train somewhere on a track you cannot see. And on that land, somewhere out past where the dirt road ends and the terrain becomes just cracked earth and rock, there is a hole. It wasn't there before. I know every inch of that property, and one morning it was just there. Art Bell asks him to describe it. The caller says it appeared suddenly. He does not know when exactly. He noticed it on a morning in late summer, and it had not been there the week before when he had walked that section of land checking the fence line. It is perfectly circular, roughly 6 feet across. The edges are clean, not crumbled, not jagged the way they would be if the ground had simply given way. Just a smooth, precise opening in the earth, as though something had been removed rather than fallen through. There is no debris around it, no ring of displaced soil, no mound of excavated rock. Whatever created it left no material evidence of its own existence. He dropped rocks in. He counted. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5. He listened until the silence became uncomfortable and then kept listening past that. Nothing. No impact. No echo bouncing back up from limestone walls 40 feet down, the way you get with a dry well. No soft thud against soil. No sound at all. Just the rocks disappearing into the dark, and then nothing. As though the rocks simply ceased to exist somewhere below the reach of ordinary physics. He tied a flashlight to a rope. A good flashlight. one of the heavy 6 battery models that could throw a beam a considerable distance in clear air. He lowered it slowly, letting the rope out hand over hand. The light grew smaller as it descended. Then it did not grow smaller. It simply disappeared. Not faded the way a light fades when it passes behind an obstruction. Just gone. As if the darkness below a certain depth was not darkness, but something else entirely. Something that absorbed rather than merely excluded light. He pulled the rope back up. The flashlight was still there, still on, still warm, but had clearly passed through something that swallowed its beam entirely. Then the caller says the thing that changes the temperature of the entire conversation. Sometimes, I hear something moving down there. Art Bell is quiet for a moment. Then he asks, moving how? The caller says he cannot describe it precisely. Not like an animal, not like water, not like anything settling. It is deliberate. That is the word he uses. Deliberate. Like something that knows it is in a specific place and is choosing to be there. The call ends abruptly, mid-sentence. Not a hang-up, more like a cut. Static, and then silence, and then the next caller is on the line talking about something else entirely, and Art Bell moves on the way live radio requires you to move on, and the moment passes. But the moment does not disappear. Act 1. The recording decades pass. Art Bell himself would go on to leave Coast to Coast AM multiple times over the following years, citing personal and family reasons, returning, leaving again. He passed away on April 13th, 2018, at his home in Pahrump, Nevada, the same desert home from which he had broadcast to millions of sleepless Americans for more than 2 decades. He was 72 years old. Coast to Coast AM continued under different hosts and continues to this day. The archives of those thousands of hours of broadcasting exist in various forms, some official, some preserved by dedicated fans who recorded episodes on cassette tapes and later digitized them. The complete archive is vast and imperfectly catalogued. There are nights that are well-documented, famous episodes with named guests whose interviews were transcribed and discussed online for years. And then there are the other nights, the ordinary nights with anonymous callers whose names were never recorded, and whose stories vanished into the radio static the moment the broadcast ended. It is in this second category, the ordinary, unnamed, undocumented calls, that a researcher named Daniel Harker finds what he's looking for. Harker is, by the time of this story, a man in his late 30s who has spent the better part of a decade doing what most people would consider an unusual kind of archival work. He is not affiliated with a university. He does not work for a media organisation. He is, in the loosest and most accurate sense of the term, an independent researcher. Someone who became interested in the overlap between documented history and undocumented experience, between the things that were recorded and the things that were real but left no official trace. His particular focus, in the years leading up to the discovery, had been the gap between broadcast radio archives and the lived experience of the people who called in to shows like Coast to Coast AM. He was interested in what happened after the call, whether the things people reported could be traced, followed up on, connected to verifiable events in the physical world. Most of the time they could not. Most of the time the call was the only artifact, a voice, a claim, a moment of contact between one person's private reality and a national audience, and then silence. He comes across the call during a cataloguing session, in which he is working through a collection of recordings from the late 1990s that had been donated to a small digital preservation project by the estate of a coast-to-coast AM enthusiast who had recorded nearly every broadcast for several years. The recording is labelled, in the handwriting of whoever made the original tape, simply, Unresolved. Caller terminated early. It is filed between 2 other recordings with proper dates and guest names. This one has no date, no episode number, no note about the subject matter beyond that single phrase. Harker listens to it once, then again, then a third time with headphones, in a quiet room, at 2 a.m. When it ends, cut off mid-sentence, caller's voice replaced by static and then nothing, he sits for a long time without moving. He begins searching for more information. What he finds is, in its own way, almost as strange as the call itself. There is no transcript. Transcripts of notable coast-to-coast AM segments had been created by fans and archived on various websites over the years, particularly for episodes with well-known guests or particularly dramatic content. For this call, nothing. No fan site mentions it. No discussion forum thread references it. No secondary source of any kind acknowledges its existence. He searches for the clip in digitized archive collections. He finds the recordings on either side of it, the dated episodes that bookend it in the donors collection, but the clip itself appears in only one other place, a partial recording in a different collection, also undated, also without context, trimmed even shorter than the version Harker already has, as though whoever copied it had stopped the tape before the call became interesting. He reaches out to the unofficial coast-to-coast AM archiving community, a loose network of dedicated enthusiasts who have spent years reconstructing the broadcast history of the show with a kind of patient obsessiveness that characterises the best amateur historians. They are helpful, they are thorough, and they have nothing. One of them, a man who has catalogued more than 4,000 hours of coast-to-coast AM recordings going back to the early 1990s, tells Harker something that stays with him. He says, some segments just don't survive. The tape runs out. The recording equipment fails. The caller says something that makes the producer hesitant to archive it officially, and it falls through the cracks. It happens more than people realise. The absence of a record is not evidence of suppression. It is usually just evidence of entropy. Harker acknowledges this. He writes it down, and then he keeps looking anyway. Act 2. The location. What Harker does next is, by his own account, not something he expected to work. He isolates the audio from the call, everything beneath the caller's voice, the acoustic texture of the recording itself, and subjects it to a process of analysis that he describes as essentially forensic listening. He is trying to hear the place the caller is calling from rather than the words the caller is saying. The call was almost certainly made from a landline. The audio characteristics are consistent with the telephone infrastructure of the late 1990s, and the signal quality, while not perfect, lacks the compression artifacts that would indicate a cellular connection. The caller is therefore almost certainly calling from a fixed location, his home, or possibly a neighbour's home if he truly lives somewhere as remote as he describes. Beneath the voice, Harker identifies several environmental sounds that bleed through the ambient audio of the recording. There is wind, a low, intermittent pressure against a surface, consistent with a single-pane window in an older building on an exposed site. There is, faintly and only perceptible at high volume, what sounds like a distant metallic resonance. Not a vehicle, not machinery, but the kind of sound produced by metal structures in wind, like a grain silo or a water tower, or an old windmill turning slowly on a dry night. And there is a radio frequency artifact in the recording itself, a specific pattern of interference that Harker, after considerable research, determines is consistent with proximity to certain types of radio navigation infrastructure that was in use in the American Southwest during the 1990s. None of this gives him coordinates. None of it gives him a county or a state, but it gives him parameters. He cross-references the environmental audio characteristics with geographic and infrastructural data from the relevant era. He looks at areas of the American Southwest that in the late 1990s had significant expanses of privately held desert land, restricted or semi-restricted airspace within a reasonable distance. The kind of radio navigation infrastructure that could produce the interference signature he identified, and sparse enough population that a man could own land and genuinely not encounter his neighbours for weeks at a time. Several regions emerge as candidates. He narrows them using additional details from the call itself. The caller's mention of a fence line he was checking, suggesting a property large enough to require a fence inspection as a routine task. His comfort with physical labour and land management, suggesting someone with real experience living in and working remote terrain. And the particular quality of the silence he describes when he drops rocks into the hole, which to Harker's ear is consistent with high desert rather than lower elevation terrain. After several weeks of analysis, He identifies a region in the desert southwest as his primary focus area. He does not publish this analysis before travelling there. He does not tell anyone where he is going. He packs equipment, audio recording gear, a high-quality camera, measurement tools, a significant length of rope, and drives out. He tells people he is going camping. He does not expect to find anything. He expects, and at some level hopes, to spend 3 days walking empty land, find nothing, and come home able to say with confidence that he had checked and there was nothing to check. What he finds instead will occupy the next several years of his life. Act 3. The Hole. He almost walks past it. He has been on the land for most of the day, covering ground methodically on foot, when the afternoon light shifts and the angle of the sun catches the edge of an opening in the earth, roughly 30 metres ahead of him and slightly to his left. He stops. He looks at it for what he later describes as a long time, standing perfectly still, simply looking, the way you stand when your mind has registered something that it does not yet know how to process. Then he walks toward it slowly. The hole is exactly as described. This is the part that unsettles him most, he will later say. Not the hole itself, but the precision of the match. He had listened to that recording dozens of times. He knew the description intimately, and standing at the edge of this opening in the ground, he finds that the description is accurate in every detail, in a way that feels almost too accurate, the way a thing feels when it has been prepared. Rather than discovered, it is circular. Not approximately circular, not nearly circular. Circular in a way that suggests either extraordinary geological coincidence or deliberate formation. The diameter is consistent with the caller's description of roughly 6 feet. The inner walls, which Harker can see for several metres by leaning over the edge with a flashlight, are smooth. Not polished, not glassy, but smooth in the way that suggests the absence of the normal roughness you would expect from broken or eroded rock. There is no debris ring. This is, geologically speaking, among the most difficult things to explain. Natural formations, sinkholes, lava tubes, collapsed caverns, all produce some form of surface disturbance. Material has to go somewhere. When a cavity opens beneath the surface, the collapse sends material outward and upward, leaving evidence at the surface in the form of displaced soil, broken rock, a ring of disturbed earth around the opening. There is none of that here. The ground at the edge of the hole is undisturbed, the surface continuing right up to the opening as though the opening has always been there, as though the land simply never included whatever would have occupied that space. Harker sets up his equipment carefully before he does anything else. He wants a record of the site before he disturbs it in any way. He photographs it from multiple angles in multiple lighting conditions. He measures the diameter, 6 feet and 3 inches, which he notes with the kind of particular attention that comes from knowing you are documenting something that may be challenged. He describes everything he observes into a voice recorder in the methodical, affectless tone of someone giving a deposition. Then he drops a rock. He has brought a small collection of rocks specifically for this purpose, not picked up from the site, but carried with him so he knows their weight and approximate density. He holds the first one over the centre of the opening and lets it go. He counts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He counts to 30, then to 60. No impact, no echo, no sound of any kind returning from below. He drops a second rock, then a third. He times each one precisely with a stopwatch. Nothing. Whatever is below the opening, if anything is below it in the conventional sense, is not producing any acoustic return that he can detect standing at the surface. The silence is not neutral. Harker writes about this later in considerable detail, because he wants to be accurate about something that is difficult to describe. The silence that comes back from the hole is different from the silence of the desert around him. The desert has ambient noise, wind, distant birds, the creak of his own equipment. The silence from the hole is the absence of all of that. It is like a silence that actively fills the space above the opening, a silence with a texture to it, a density, as though whatever is down, there absorbs sound rather than reflecting it. He stays at the site until the light fails. He does not lower the rope that day. He goes back to his vehicle, drives to a gas station 40 minutes away, eats something, and sits in the parking lot for a long time looking at nothing. Then he drives back and camps near the site overnight. At some point in the early hours of the morning, he cannot say exactly when because he's fallen into a light sleep, he wakes up. He lies still in his sleeping bag and listens. From the direction of the hole, across the dark and the silence, he hears something. Not a sound he can identify, not an impact or a settling or a geological groan. Movement, deliberate and unhurried. This sound of something that is exactly where it intends to be. He does not go to look. He lies still until dawn, and when the sun comes up, he goes back to the edge of the hole and begins to set up the camera. Act 4. The investigation. Before he lowers anything else into the hole, Harker begins researching the land itself. He wants to know who owns it, who owned it before, whether there is any record of activity here, mining operations, geological surveys, government programs, anything that might explain what he is looking at from a conventional perspective before he entertains an unconventional one. The land ownership records, when he begins to trace them, are unusual in a specific and narrow way. The property was, according to the most complete records Harker can access, in private hands during the late 1990s, consistent with the caller's claim to ownership. But the name attached to the ownership record at that time is difficult to trace beyond the record itself. It appears in the land registry and in a small number of related administrative documents, but it does not appear in the other places a real person's name would normally appear. No property tax records for the years preceding or following, no voter, registration, no telephone directory listing from the era. The name exists in the specific narrow context of this property, and essentially nowhere else. This alone is not conclusive. People own land under corporate entities or trusts for legitimate reasons. Remote desert land in the American Southwest changes hands in ways that are not always tidily documented. Harker notes it and continues. The property changed ownership in the year or two following the period of the call. Then it changed hands again, and again, in relatively short succession, for a piece of remote desert land that would have had no obvious commercial value and that showed no sign of development. By the time Harker is looking at the records, the land is formally listed as unimproved and of negligible assessed value, currently held by an entity whose registered address resolves to a mail forwarding service. Harker files a series of public records requests through the appropriate channels. Several come back with responsive documents that are unremarkable. Several come back with the notation that no responsive documents exist, and 2 come back with a response he does not initially know what to do with. The requests are acknowledged, and then, weeks later, he receives letters notifying him that the documents he requested, if they exist, would fall under exemptions that preclude their release under the relevant Freedom of Information statutes. He is not told what exemption. He is not told whether documents exist. He's told only that if they do, he cannot have them. He then turns to satellite imagery. Archival satellite and aerial imagery of the American Southwest is available, with varying resolution and coverage, going back to the 1960s through a combination of declassified intelligence sources and commercial satellite operators. The coverage of this specific parcel of land is not comprehensive. It is, after all, remote and unremarkable land with no obvious reason to image, regularly. But there are enough historical images to construct a rough timeline of what the surface of the land has looked like at various points. What Harker finds in that timeline is this. In the period spanning roughly 3 to 4 years following the approximate date of the Art Bell call, the satellite record shows the intermittent presence of what appear to be temporary structures near the site of the hole. The structures appear in one image, are absent in the next available image taken months later, reappear again in a subsequent image, and then disappear definitively sometime before the imagery record resumes after a gap of approximately 2 years. The structures are not large, they are not permanent. They could be many things: survey equipment, temporary shelters set up by a geological team, equipment left by a utility company doing work in the region. There is no official record that Harker can find of any permitted activity on the land during this period. No mining, permits, no geological survey filings, no utility work orders. This absence does not mean nothing happened there. It means that if something happened there, it was either too minor to require permits, or it did not go through permitting channels. Harker speaks to several geologists during this period. He does not tell them about the hole directly. He frames his questions as related to a theoretical formation, a geological curiosity he has read about, something he wants to understand better. What could produce a perfectly circular opening in desert terrain? What natural process could result in smooth inner walls without a debris field? What formation type could produce effectively infinite acoustic depth? No echoing, no return signal from a dropped object. The geologists he consults are thoughtful and engaged and offer several possibilities. Sinkholes formed in karst terrain, limestone geology dissolving from beneath, creating cavities that eventually surface collapse, can be circular, but they produce debris fields and uneven edges. Lava tubes, the hollow channels left by flowing lava after the outer shell solidifies, can be smooth-walled, but they are not circular in cross-section, and they have detectable depths. There are desert formations, particularly in areas with specific mineral compositions, where water erosion or wind erosion over geological timescales can produce unusual shapes. But none of the geologists can produce a natural process that would generate all of the observed characteristics simultaneously. Perfect circularity, smooth walls, no surface disturbance, and no acoustic return from a dropped object over a count of more than 60 seconds. One of them says something that Harker finds more interesting than the others. She says, "Absence of a known explanation is not the same thing as impossibility. Geology still surprises us. There are formations in remote areas of the world that we do not have complete theories for. It does not mean the explanation is something other than geology. It means we have not found the right geology yet." Harker appreciates this. He writes it down, and then he goes back to the hole and lowers the camera. Act 5. What the camera found. The camera is a small, high-definition unit attached to a waterproof housing, designed for caving and underground exploration. It has its own lighting, a ring of LEDs that can illuminate several meters of underground space, and it transmits a live feed via cable rather than wirelessly, which means Harker can watch the descent in real time on a small monitor while standing at the surface. He has attached the camera to a measured rope, a rope with markings at every meter so he can track exactly how far the camera has descended at any given moment. He has also attached a small barometric sensor that will record pressure changes and a thermometer. He lowers the camera slowly. For the first several meters, what the camera shows is consistent with what you would expect from any narrow, deep opening in rock. Smooth walls, the LED light throwing hard shadows against stone, the circle of daylight above the camera shrinking as the camera descends. The walls are the colour of the surrounding rock, slightly darker where they're shaded. Nothing remarkable except for their smoothness. At roughly 15 metres, the walls change slightly in colour, a gradual shift toward a deeper grey, the rock becoming denser in appearance, the texture finer. This is consistent with deeper geological layers and would not, in isolation, be notable. At approximately 25 metres, two things happen simultaneously. The temperature sensor registers a drop, not a gradual cooling, which you would expect from descending below the surface layer. A sudden and significant drop, several degrees within a vertical span of less than 2 metres. Harker notes this on his recording and keeps lowering the camera. And then, the walls change. The change is subtle at first and then unmistakable. The surface of the walls below the temperature drop does not look like natural rock formation. It looks, and Harker struggles to describe this in terms that are both accurate and not inflammatory. It looks ordered. Not carved, not machined in any recognisable way, but ordered. The random micro-texture of natural stone, the slight variations in grain and surface that you see in any geological material, is replaced by something more regular. Regular in the way that crystals are regular, not human-made regularity, but a structure that follows geometric rules rather than geological chaos. Harker keeps the camera at this depth for a long time. He rotates it slowly, examining the walls from multiple angles. The structure is consistent around the entire circumference of the hole. Whatever produced it, whatever changed the character of the walls at this depth, It did so evenly, completely, with no variation. He lowers the camera further. At this point, the audio on his recording equipment begins to distort. Not the camera feed, the camera continues to transmit clearly, but his surface recording equipment picks up an interference pattern that he will later identify as consistent with a very specific type of electromagnetic disturbance. Not radio interference in the conventional sense, something narrower, more focused, as though the source of the interference is directional, coming from below. The camera reaches the end of the measured rope at 40 meters. The feed shows walls that continue downward, the same structured surface, disappearing into darkness below the range of the LED ring. There is no bottom visible, there is no change in the character of the walls that would suggest an approaching floor or ceiling. The hole simply continues, and then, with the camera at the 40-meter mark, hanging motionless in the dark, something moves across the frame, not falling, not rising, moving horizontally. It is not a clear image. The camera is not designed to capture fast movement in low light, and whatever crosses the frame does so quickly. But it is not a malfunction. It is not debris falling past the lens. It is a shape, moving with what Harker, watching the recording frame by frame later, will describe as intent. The way a thing moves when it is going somewhere specific rather than falling somewhere random. He pulls the camera up immediately. His hands are not steady. The rope comes up too fast and the camera knocks against the wall once before clearing the top and coming into daylight. He examines it. The housing is undamaged. The lens is clear. There is no mark on it, no residue, nothing to indicate contact with anything. He packs his equipment and leaves the site that afternoon. He does not return for 6 months. Ast 6. The others. Harker is not the first person to have looked for the hole. This is something he discovers gradually, in the way you discover most things that were hidden not by active concealment but by simple diffusion. The information was out there, scattered across different platforms and archives and conversations, in pieces small enough that no single piece announced itself as significant. It is only when you have enough of the pieces that the shape of the thing becomes visible. The first indication comes from a response to his published research, not a public comment, a private message sent through the research platform's internal messaging system, from an account with no profile information and no prior activity on the platform. The message is 4 sentences long. It says that Harker is not the first person to document the site, that at least 2 other individuals working independently and at different times had located the hole before him, that one of them stopped communicating with their research contacts in the period following their second visit to the site, and that if Harker has any interest in his own continued well-being, he should consider the pattern. Then the account is deleted. The message remains in his inbox. The platform preserves received messages even if the sender account is removed, but there is no way to follow up, no thread to pull. Harker sits with this for a while before deciding to take it seriously as a data point rather than as a threat or as noise. He begins searching, this time not for information about the hole itself, but for information about other people who might have been looking for it. He finds fragments. There is, in the archive discussion forums of the early 2000s, the era before social media consolidated online conversation into a handful of large platforms, a thread on a paranormal research board that describes, in terms very similar to the original Art Bell call, a hole in the desert southwest. The thread is started by a user whose handle is an ordinary word followed by a sequence of numbers, the kind of handle that suggests someone who chose it without much thought, rather than someone constructing an identity. The user describes travelling to a remote location based on research they had done, finding a circular opening in the ground, observing its characteristics. The thread runs for a few dozen replies, other users asking questions, offering theories, expressing skepticism, and then the original poster simply stops responding. The thread eventually closes due to inactivity. The original poster's account shows no further activity on any thread on the platform after the date they stopped responding to that one. This could mean many things. People abandon online accounts for entirely ordinary reasons. The original poster may have decided the research was not worth continuing and moved on. But the timing is specific. They stopped engaging immediately after a post in which they described making a second visit to the site and observing something in the camera feed that they said they were not yet ready to describe publicly and would share in a follow-up post. There is no follow-up post. The second fragment is less precise but more disturbing in its own way. It is a passing reference in a self-published memoir by a former land surveyor who worked in the American Southwest from the 1980s through the early 2000s. The memoir is primarily about the logistics and culture of land surveying, a dry and detailed account of a professional life that most people would find uninteresting. But buried in a chapter about unusual sights encountered during survey work, the author describes being sent in the late 1990s to survey a parcel of land for a client he never met in person, and whose name he was told was not to be included in his written reports. He describes arriving at the site and completing most of the survey before encountering, in one corner of the property, an opening in the ground that caused him to stop work. He describes its characteristics briefly and accurately. He describes calling his contact number for the job and being told, in a conversation he describes as very short and very clear, to finish the survey, to not include the opening in his filed documents, and to not discuss what he had seen with anyone. He says he followed these instructions. He says he has regretted it ever since, not because he believes anything supernatural about what he saw, but because he has spent the intervening years wondering what it was, and knowing that the answer exists somewhere in documents that he helped to keep incomplete. The memoir was self-published in a print run of 200 copies, distributed through a regional press that no longer exists. Harker obtains a copy through an interlibrary loan from a small county library system. The surveyor's name is in the book, but he has, by the time Harker finds the memoir, been dead for 3 years. There is no one left to ask follow-up questions of. And then there is the third fragment, which is the one Harker finds most difficult to account for and most difficult to set aside. It is a photograph. Not a digital photograph, a physical photograph, the kind printed from 35mm film, mailed to Harker's research platform's physical address by an anonymous sender on an undated postcard with no return address and no message beyond the photograph itself. The photograph shows, from a perspective Harker estimates is roughly standing height above the ground, a circular opening in what is clearly desert terrain. The light in the photograph is the particular quality of late afternoon desert light, the way it cuts low and hard across a flat surface, throwing sharp shadows. The opening in the photograph is clearly the same site, the same smooth edges, the same absence of a debris ring, the same quality of simply being there without explanation. The photograph is old. The paper stock, the colour saturation, the particular grain of the film, Harker shows it to someone who works with archival photographs professionally, without telling them where it came from or what it shows. The assessment is that the photograph was taken in the 1970s, possibly the mid-1970s, possibly earlier. If that assessment is correct, then the hole was there before the Art Bell call by at least 2 decades. It was there before the call, and before the temporary structures in the satellite imagery, and before the land ownership transfer, and before any of the documented history that Harker has been able to construct. It was there when the government programs described in the redacted documents were in their early stages. It was there, perhaps, before anyone currently alive was looking for it. How long before? That is a question that the available evidence cannot answer. The photograph is the oldest record Harker has. But the absence of an older record does not mean the hole is not older still. It means only that no one who looked at it earlier left a trace that has survived, or that the traces they left were removed. Ached 7. The theory. In the months that follow, Harker works through what he observed with the same methodical care he has applied to everything else. He is not, by temperament or training, someone inclined toward dramatic conclusions. He is someone who lives in the gap between what has been documented and what has been experienced, and he knows better than most people how large that gap can be, and how many things exist in it that are strange and real and entirely explicable once you find the right explanation. He starts with the conventional. He reviews the geological literature on anomalous formations in desert terrain. He corresponds with researchers who study karst topography, volcanic geology, and underground hydrology. He submits the temperature data from the camera descent to a physicist who specialises in subsurface thermal dynamics. The physicist's assessment is that the temperature drop Harker recorded is not consistent with normal geothermal gradients. Temperatures underground generally increase with depth, rather than drop sharply at a specific boundary, and that while localised cold spots do exist in cave systems and underground water channels, the profile he recorded is unusual enough to warrant further study. He researches historical government activity in the region. This part of the investigation takes him into territory he had not initially intended to explore. The American Southwest was, throughout the Cold War era and into the 1980s and 90s, the site of a significant number of classified and semi-classified programs involving underground research, seismic monitoring, deep drilling, and what the government euphemistically described in budget documents as subsurface characterization. Most of these programs were aimed at understanding the geology of potential underground nuclear test sites, monitoring seismic activity for treaty verification purposes, or exploring the deep earth for strategic resources. Several of these programs, Harker discovers, extended their activities to sites in the region where the hole is located. Most of the documentation he can access is heavily redacted. What remains describes, in the carefully neutral language of government technical reports, programs that were exploring depth ranges and geological characteristics that go well beyond what you would need for conventional resource extraction or seismic monitoring. One document, a partially declassified summary from a program whose full title is redacted, refers to what it calls a natural access anomaly. The phrase appears once, in a list of terms used in a related classified glossary that the document references but does not reproduce. Harker searches every available database for this phrase in this context. He finds it in two other documents, both heavily redacted, both connected to programs operating in the late 1980s and early 1990s. None of the documents describe what a natural access anomaly is. None of them provide coordinates or site descriptions. They simply use the phrase in passing, the way you use technical terminology when you're writing for an audience that already knows what it means. Harker is left, after all of this, with two frameworks that can accommodate what he has observed. The first is that the hole is a genuine geological anomaly, a formation produced by processes that are not yet fully understood, exhibiting characteristics that fall outside the current documented range of natural formations, but ultimately explicable in physical terms. The temperature drop, the wall structure change, the acoustic properties, all of these, on this reading, are features of a natural system that science has not yet characterized. The shape that moved across the camera frame was something falling in the darkness. Below the camera's range, its trajectory distorted by the wide-angle lens and the conditions of the recording. The second is more difficult to articulate without sounding like something other than a careful researcher. But Harker articulates it carefully anyway, because he has earned the right to speculate by having done everything else correctly first. The second framework is that the hole is not a hole in the conventional sense. It is not a void formed by the absence of material. It is something more like an interface, a boundary between two spaces that, in every physical respect, should not be adjacent. The structured quality of the walls below a certain depth is not a sign of artificial construction. It is what the boundary looks like from inside. On this reading, the caller was right, and the researchers who followed were right, and the temporary structures and the redacted documents and the phrase natural access anomaly are all pointing at the same thing from different directions. Something is there, something that does not fit into the existing vocabulary of geology or physics, something that moves and that knows you are above it, and that has been there long enough that at least some people in positions of authority have known about it and decided, for reasons of their own, not to say so. Harker publishes his findings on a small research platform, not a conspiracy website, an independent research journal of the kind that exists in the margins of academia, read mostly by people who take seriously the possibility that the official record is incomplete. He presents his evidence. He presents both frameworks. He does not tell people what to believe. He waits to see what happens. Epilogue. The second call. Several months after the publication of Harker's findings, an audio file appears online. It shows up in a thread on one of the forums where Harker's research has been discussed. It is posted by an account that was created the day the file was posted and has never posted anything else. The account name is a string of numbers that resolves to nothing when searched. The file has no metadata. Audio files, when recorded on modern devices, carry a significant amount of embedded data. The device used to record them, the date and time of recording, GPS coordinates if location services were active. This file has none of that. It has been stripped clean, or it was recorded on a device, or using a method that does not produce metadata in the conventional sense. The recording is 43 seconds long. It begins with silence. Several seconds of it. Not dead silence, but ambient silence. Outdoor silence. The faint breath of open space. Then a voice. The voice is calm. It is unhurried. It speaks at a measured pace. The pace of someone who knows exactly what they want to say and has no concern about being cut off before they finish. Harker listens to the recording the first time the way anyone listens to anything new, with attention divided between the surface of the thing and the process of trying to make sense of it. Then he listens again. Then he listens to it back to back with the original Art Bell call, comparing them with careful attention. The voice is not the same voice. It is a different person, different age, different resonance, different cadence. But the quality of it, the steadiness, the absence of performance, the sense that the speaker is telling you something they have decided you should know while remaining entirely unmoved by your reaction to it, is identical. It has the same tonal character as the original call, the same quality of measured, unhurried disclosure. The voice says, "You were not supposed to find it again." Then, after a pause of approximately 4 seconds, it says, "It is not empty." Then the recording ends. Not static this time, just silence, and then nothing, and then the player reading 0 seconds remaining and the cursor blinking in the dark of a screen. Harker considers these two statements for a long time. You were not supposed to find it again. Not, you were not supposed to find it. Again. Which implies that someone found it before. Which implies that the first finding was also unintended, or at least unwelcome. The original caller found it in the late 1990s and made a radio call about it, and then fell out of the record entirely. Harker found it decades later through audio forensics and satellite imagery and public records requests. Both findings, apparently, were findings that should not have happened. It is not empty. This one Harker sits with longer. The original caller described something moving in the hole, something deliberate, something present. The camera showed something moving at depth, and now a voice is confirming, with the confidence of someone who knows rather than someone who suspects, that whatever is down there is not nothing, is not a geological artifact, is not empty space and echoes and the acoustic properties of unusual rock formations, is something. The thread where the audio file was posted is still accessible technically. The platform has not removed it, but the file itself no longer loads. The link resolves to an error. Harker, who downloaded it immediately when it appeared, still has a copy. He has not republished it. He has not described the full analysis he performed on it. He has noted its existence in an addendum to his original research publication, and left it there, as a data point, as something that happened and that he cannot yet fully account for. He returned to the site once more, in the year following the publication of his research. He did not bring camera equipment. He brought only a voice recorder and a notebook and a measured length of rope. He stood at the edge of the hole in the early afternoon, when the light was as direct as it gets in that part of the desert, and he looked down into it for a long time. He did not drop anything in, he just listened. And then he walked back to his vehicle and drove away and did not write about what he heard, if anything. That part of the record remains, for now, incomplete. Final note. The original Art Bell call still exists. It exists in at least 2 known recordings, both fragmentary, both without date or identifying information. Art Bell, Arthur William Bell III, who was born on June 17, 1945, and who died on April 13, 2018, received thousands of calls over more than 2 decades of broadcasting. Most of them were never followed up on. This one was not followed up on in any official capacity. The hole remains, unmarked on any map that Harker has been able to find, uncatalogued in any geological survey, unmentioned in any document that bears an official seal and is freely available to the public. The land it sits on is, according to the most recent ownership records Harker can access, still held by the entity, whose registered address resolves to a mail forwarding service. Nobody has built on it. Nobody has fenced it or gated it or put up signs. It is simply there, a parcel of remote desert land in the American Southwest that appears from the outside to be nothing but dry earth and silence. And beneath the surface of that silence, at a depth that no conventional measurement has been able to establish, in a hole that has no debris field and no acoustic return and walls that change their character at a precise and inexplicable depth boundary, something is present. Not falling, not rising, just there, patient and unhurried, in the dark, in the way of something that has been there long enough not to be concerned about being found. The call was made more than 25 years ago. The hole has been there longer than the call. And if the voice on that 43-second recording is to be believed, if it is, in any sense, a reliable account of something real, then the thing at the bottom of the hole has been there longer than any of us have been asking questions about it. It was there before the caller found it. It was there when the researchers came and built their temporary structures and then dismantled them and left. It was there when Harker stood at the edge and listened in the early afternoon light. It is there now, as you listen to this, somewhere in the dark beneath the surface of a desert that looks from the outside like just another piece of empty land. Not empty. That is the one thing we know for certain. Not empty. What if everything you thought you knew about the pyramids was wrong? Imagine standing inside the Great Pyramid of Giza at midnight, alone, surrounded by 2.3 million stone blocks that have kept their secrets for over 4 millennia. The air is thick with mystery, and you can feel something humming beneath your feet, a vibration so subtle it might just be your imagination. Or might it be something far more extraordinary? Tonight join Dr. Marcus Chen, a field researcher whose life's work straddles the boundary between archaeology and physics, as he uncovers evidence that will shake the very foundations of what we believe about ancient Egypt. This isn't just another story about pharaohs and burial chambers. This is about technology so advanced, so perfectly engineered, that modern science is only beginning to understand its true purpose. Are you ready to discover that the Great Pyramid wasn't built to house the dead, but to power the living? The desert wind carried more than sand that October evening. It carried the weight of 4,000 years of secrets, swirling around the massive limestone blocks that rose from the Giza Plateau like ancient guardians against the darkening sky. Dr. Marcus Chen pulled his field jacket tighter as he approached the entrance to the Great Pyramid, his archaeological permit clutched in one hand and a case of sensitive instruments in the other. For 15 years, Marcus had studied these monuments from afar, poring over blueprints in university libraries, analysing satellite imagery, and debating theories with colleagues over late-night coffee. He'd written papers on the pyramid's mathematical precision, its astronomical alignments, and its construction techniques. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. The entrance shaft yawned before him like the mouth of some primordial beast. His Egyptian guide, Hassan, gestured him forward with a weathered hand that had led countless tourists through these passages. But tonight was different. Tonight Marcus had special permission to remain inside after closing, to conduct his research in the profound silence that only comes when the tourist crowds fade away. "Doctor?" "Chen," Hassan said, his English tinged with the accent of the Nile Delta. "You're sure you want to stay alone? The pyramid. She speaks differently at night." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what Hassan meant. I need to take measurements without interference. The electromagnetic readings are too important to risk contamination from cameras and cell phones. As they ducked through the entrance and began their descent into the ancient passageway, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. A subtle vibration through the soles of his boots. It was barely perceptible, like standing near a power plant or a subway station, but unmistakably present. The limestone blocks seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, as if the entire structure were somehow alive. "Hassan," he said, pausing to place his palm against the cool stone wall. "Do you feel that?" The guide's eyes met his in the dim LED lighting they'd strung along the passage. "You feel it too?" Most visitors, they notice nothing, but some, the ones who know how to listen, they feel the heart of the pyramid beating. Marcus's scientific mind immediately began cataloguing possible explanations. Seismic activity from Cairo traffic, thermal expansion and contraction of the limestone, perhaps underground water movement. But as they climbed deeper into the structure, following the grand gallery toward the king's chamber, the sensation only grew stronger. The textbooks had described every measurement, every angle, every architectural feature, but they had failed to capture this, the sense that he was walking through the corridors of a machine rather than a tomb. The walls weren't just precisely cut, they were purposeful, functional, as if each block had been positioned not just to support weight, but to channel something else entirely. By the time Hassan left him alone in the king's chamber with his instruments, and a promise to return at dawn, Marcus was beginning to suspect that everything he thought he knew about the Great Pyramid was about to change. The silence in the king's chamber was absolute. Not the gentle quiet of a library or the muffled stillness of a snow-covered landscape, but the profound absence of sound that only exists deep within solid rock far from the surface world. Marcus set his equipment case on the granite floor and began unpacking his instruments, but his eyes kept returning to the walls around him. For a structure supposedly built as the eternal resting place of Pharaoh Khufu, the king's chamber was remarkably empty. No hieroglyphs adorned the walls, no colourful depictions of the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife, no ornate decorations celebrating his divine status, just smooth, precisely fitted granite blocks that formed a perfect rectangular space. Marcus had visited dozens of legitimate Egyptian tombs, from the elaborate burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings to smaller mastabas scattered throughout the desert. Every single one had been filled with artwork, inscriptions and symbolic elements designed to guide and protect the deceased in the afterlife. The Egyptians were obsessive about decorating their tombs. It was perhaps their most distinctive cultural trait. So why was the most important tomb in Egypt completely bare? He pulled out his digital calipers and began measuring the chamber's dimensions, cross-referencing them with his notes. 10.47 metres long, 5.24 metres wide, 5.84 metres high. But as he worked, something else caught his attention. The acoustics. "Hello?" he called out softly, and the word came back to him transformed. Not a simple echo, but something more complex. A resonance that seemed to build upon itself, creating harmonics that his voice alone couldn't produce. He clapped his hands sharply and the sound reverberated through the chamber in waves, each echo slightly different from the last. Marcus had studied acoustical engineering as part of his physics background, and he knew what he was hearing. The chamber was tuned. The proportions, the materials, even the placement in the pyramid weren't arbitrary. They had been calculated to create specific resonant frequencies. He set up his sound meter and began a systematic test, clapping at different spots around the chamber and recording the acoustic response. The data was remarkable. The chamber was resonating at approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that research had shown could induce altered states of consciousness in humans. Ancient peoples around the world had built structures with similar acoustic properties. Newgrange in Ireland, the Hippogæum in Malta, certain chambers at Stonehenge. But there was something more. As Marcus moved his sound meter around the room, he noticed that the acoustic properties weren't uniform. The northeast corner produced different harmonics than the southwest. The centre of the chamber created the strongest resonance, while areas near the walls seemed to dampen certain frequencies while amplifying others. It was as if the entire chamber had been designed as a three-dimensional instrument, capable of producing complex acoustic patterns that modern sound engineers would struggle to replicate. This wasn't the work of ancient stonemasons building a burial vault. This was the product of sophisticated understanding of wave mechanics and acoustic engineering. Marcus sat cross-legged in the centre of the chamber and closed his eyes, letting the subtle vibrations he'd felt earlier wash over him. The sensation was stronger here, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. It reminded him of standing next to a massive pipe organ, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest cavity. But there were no pipes here, no mechanical system that could produce such vibrations, unless... He opened his eyes and looked up at the ceiling, with its 9 massive granite beams supporting thousands of tons of limestone above. Each beam weighed between 25 and 80 tons, and had been quarried from Aswan 500 miles to the south. The precision with which they'd been placed was extraordinary. The gaps between them were uniform to within millimetres. What if those gaps weren't just structural? What if they were intentional spacing, designed to create specific resonant frequencies when subjected to external forces? The entire chamber could be functioning as a resonating cavity, with the granite beams acting as tuning elements. Marcus pulled out his electromagnetic field detector and switched it on. Immediately the device began registering low-level EM activity. Not strong, but definitely present and distinctly non-random. The readings were strongest near the walls and seemed to pulse in rhythm with the vibrations he could feel through the floor. No pharaoh had ever been found in this chamber. No evidence of burial had ever been discovered. No grave goods, no mummy. No indication that this space had ever served its supposed purpose as a tomb. But it was definitely serving some purpose. The question was, what? The next morning, Hassan returned to find Marcus still awake, surrounded by printouts from his instruments and covered in limestone dust. The researcher had spent the night exploring every accessible passage in the pyramid, and his findings were beginning to form a picture that contradicted everything in the archaeological textbooks. "Dr. Chen, you look like you have seen the jinn," Hassan said, offering him a thermos of strong coffee. "What did the pyramid tell you?" Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully and gestured toward his scattered notes. "Hassan, I need to see the subterranean chamber, the one most tourists never visit." Hassan's expression grew serious. "That chamber, she is dangerous, very old, very deep. The air is not good there." "I have proper equipment," Marcus insisted, "and I think what's down there might be the key to understanding what this place really is." An hour later, they were descending through a narrow shaft that led to the lowest accessible level of the pyramid. The subterranean chamber lay more than 30 metres beneath the base of the structure, carved directly from the bedrock. As they went deeper, the temperature dropped and the air grew thick with moisture. The passage opened into a rough-hewn chamber unlike anything else in the pyramid. Where the king's chamber was precisely cut granite, this space looked unfinished, almost crude. But Marcus wasn't interested in the chamber itself, he was focused on the walls. "Hassan, bring the light closer." The LED beam revealed what Marcus had hoped to find: unmistakable signs of water erosion. The limestone walls bore the smooth, flowing patterns that only come from sustained contact with moving water. Not the random pitting of desert sandstorms or the crystalline deposits of occasional flooding, but the systematic erosion of deliberate water flow. Marcus ran his fingers along the channels carved into the rock. This wasn't occasional flooding. Water flowed through here regularly, probably for centuries. Hassan nodded. "My grandfather, he told stories. Before the dam, before the modern irrigation, the Nile would flood every year. Sometimes the water would find ways underground, through cracks and caves. Maybe it came here." But Marcus was thinking about more than just flood patterns. He pulled out a geological map of the area and spread it on his portable table. The Giza Plateau sat on a limestone shelf that extended deep underground, honeycombed with natural caves and passages. The Nile, just a few kilometres away, had carved its path through this same limestone over millions of years. Hassan, what if the annual flooding wasn't accidental? What if this chamber was designed to flood? He pointed to the roughly carved passages that branched off from the main chamber, disappearing into darkness. These could be intake channels. When the Nile floods, water would flow through underground passages and fill this chamber, then rise up through the pyramid's internal structure. Marcus began sketching a diagram, his excitement growing. Look at this. Water enters here, rises through the Grand Gallery, which is angled like a spillway, and reaches the king's chamber. But that chamber isn't at the top of the pyramid. There are shafts leading up from it. Hassan studied the drawing. You think the pyramid was some kind of water machine? Not just water. Think about what happens when you force pressurized water through granite. Hassan looked puzzled, so Marcus elaborated. Granite contains quartz crystals. When you subject quartz to mechanical pressure, like water flowing under pressure, it generates electricity. It's called the piezoelectric effect. We use it in modern electronics. The implications were staggering. If Marcus was right, the Great Pyramid wasn't a tomb at all. It was a hydroelectric generator, using the annual Nile floods to create pressurized water flow through chambers lined with granite. The precise positioning of the granite blocks, the careful engineering of the internal passages, the acoustic tuning of the chambers, all of it could be explained as components of a massive power generation system. Marcus spent the next several hours taking measurements of the subterranean chamber, documenting the erosion patterns and mapping the passages. Every piece of evidence supported his growing hypothesis. The pyramid builders hadn't just been skilled stonemasons, they had been hydraulic engineers, working with an understanding of electricity that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 18th century. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If the ancient Egyptians possessed this level of technological sophistication, what else had they known that modern archaeology had missed? And why had this knowledge been lost? As they climbed back toward the surface, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking through the ruins of a civilization far more advanced than anyone had imagined. The desert wind that greeted them at the pyramid's entrance seemed to carry whispers of forgotten science, lost wisdom, and secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The next day found Marcus standing on the Giza plateau at dawn, his GPS equipment spread out on a folding table, as the first rays of sunlight painted the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. Hassan had brought along his cousin Karim, a modern engineer who worked for the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and had access to more sophisticated surveying equipment than Marcus could carry. "Dr. Chen, you said you wanted to verify the pyramid's alignment," Karim asked, adjusting the precision GPS receiver. "I must tell you, this has been measured many times. The accuracy is well documented." Marcus nodded, checking his own instruments. "I'm not questioning the accuracy. I'm trying to understand why that accuracy was necessary." The numbers were indeed remarkable. As the GPS data streamed in and the surveying laser painted its invisible lines across the desert, the measurements confirmed what archaeologists had known for decades. The Great Pyramid was aligned to true north, with an accuracy of just 3 arc minutes, less than 1/20th of a degree. In modern terms, that was more precise than the magnetic compasses available to 19th century explorers. But Marcus was looking at more than just cardinal directions. He had brought along a magnetometer, an instrument that could detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field. As he moved the device around the pyramid's base, the readings told a fascinating story. "Karim, look at this." Marcus showed him the magnetometer display. "The pyramid isn't just aligned to true north. It's positioned at a point where the Earth's magnetic field shows unusual characteristics. The Giza Plateau sat at a convergence point of several magnetic anomalies. Underground iron ore deposits created localized field variations, while the limestone bedrock contained enough ferrous minerals to influence compass readings. But more significantly, the pyramid's position corresponded to a point where the Earth's natural electromagnetic currents were particularly strong. Marcus had studied similar phenomena at other ancient sites. Stonehenge sat on a complex intersection of underground streams and geological fault lines that created measurable electromagnetic effects. Newgrange in Ireland was positioned where 2 underground rivers converged, creating conditions that produced natural electrical fields. Machu Picchu was built on a granite peak that generated piezoelectric charges during seismic activity. The pattern was consistent. Ancient builders had chosen locations where the Earth's natural electromagnetic properties were enhanced. They hadn't just been looking for stable ground or religious significance. They had been searching for specific energetic conditions. "Hassan," Marcus called to his guide, who was photographing the sunrise from the pyramid's eastern face, your grandfather's stories, did any of them mention lights? Hassan walked over, his expression thoughtful. Lights? You mean like the tourist illumination? No, I mean lights that might have been seen historically, strange lights, unexplained phenomena. Hassan's eyes widened slightly. Ah, yes. The old people, they would speak of the lights that danced around the pyramid during certain seasons, usually during the flood time, when the Nile was high. They called them the souls of the pharaohs, but my grandfather, he was educated man. He thought maybe they were something else. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What kind of something else? He worked for British archaeologists in the 1920s. They had instruments, cameras. One night during flood season, they saw lights moving around the pyramid's apex. Blue-white lights, like electricity. The photographs they took showed, what do you call them? Discharge patterns. Electromagnetic discharge. Marcus had seen similar phenomena at other ancient sites during periods of high atmospheric electricity. If the pyramid was designed to interact with the Earth's electromagnetic field, then during certain conditions, perhaps when underground water levels were high and atmospheric electrical activity was increased, it might actually generate visible electrical discharges. Marcus spent the morning taking detailed measurements of the electromagnetic conditions around the pyramid. The data revealed a complex pattern of electrical activity that varied with the time of day, the season, and the underground water levels. The pyramid wasn't just passively sitting in an electromagnetically active location. It appeared to be designed to harness and focus that activity. The internal structure suddenly made more sense. The king's chamber, with its precise granite construction, would act as a focal point for electromagnetic energy generated by the pressure of water on quartz crystals. The shaft systems leading from the chamber would serve as waveguides, directing the electrical energy toward the pyramid's apex. The entire structure was essentially a massive electromagnetic antenna, designed to capture, generate and transmit electrical energy using natural forces. But transmit it where? And for what purpose? As Marcus packed his equipment, he realized he was no longer looking at an ancient tomb or even an advanced power plant. He was looking at a piece of technology so sophisticated that modern science was only beginning to understand its principles. The builders of the Great Pyramid hadn't just mastered hydraulic engineering and electromagnetic theory. They had created a machine that interfaced directly with the planet's own energy systems. The question that haunted him as they walked back to the nearby village was this: if such advanced technology had existed over 4,000 years ago, what had happened to the civilization that created it? Dr. Amara Soliman met Marcus at a coffee shop in central Cairo, away from the tourist crowds and government oversight that surrounded the Giza Plateau. As one of Egypt's leading thermal imaging specialists, she'd been involved in some of the most significant recent discoveries at the pyramids, including the 2015 detection of mysterious voids within the Great Pyramid structure. Dr. Chen, she said, sliding a tablet across the small table between them, what you're asking to see, these images are not for public distribution. The Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has been very careful about how this information is released. Marcus studied the thermal imaging data on the screen. The pyramid appeared as a three-dimensional wireframe, with different colours indicating temperature variations within the stone. But there, clearly visible in the computer-enhanced images, were several dark voids, empty spaces within the solid limestone structure where no chambers were supposed to exist. "How many voids have you detected?" Marcus asked. "At least 4 significant ones," Dr. Soliman replied, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. 2 above the king's chamber, 1 behind the queen's chamber, and 1 near the base that appears to connect to the subterranean areas. But there's something else. She switched to a different set of images, these taken with ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic sensors. These voids aren't natural. They show clear geometric patterns, right angles, precisely measured dimensions. Someone built these spaces intentionally, then sealed them so completely that they've remained hidden for over 4,000 years. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Have there been any attempts to access them? Dr. Solomon's expression grew troubled. That's where things become political. In 2017, an international team proposed using micro-robotics to explore one of the smaller voids. They had the technology, the funding and preliminary approval from the Archaeological Committee. Then suddenly the project was cancelled. No explanation, no appeal process, just stopped. She leaned closer, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "Dr. Chen, I've worked on heritage preservation projects throughout Egypt for 15 years. I've seen government bureaucracy, funding problems, international disputes over archaeological sites. This was different. This was suppression." Marcus thought about his own experience getting research permission. The process had taken 8 months and required letters of recommendation from 3 different universities, a detailed research proposal, and a substantial fee. But even with all that paperwork, his access was limited to already known chambers during specific time windows. "What do you think is in the sealed chambers?" he asked. Dr. Solomon switched to another set of images, these showing electromagnetic anomalies within the hidden voids. These readings suggest metallic objects, not just small artifacts, large structures with geometric patterns. If I had to guess based on the electromagnetic signatures, I'd say we're looking at copper or bronze constructions, possibly in the form of coils or geometric frameworks. Marcus's mind raced. Copper coils would be consistent with his power plant hypothesis. They could serve as electromagnetic conductors or even primitive electrical components. Bronze geometric frameworks might function as focusing elements for electromagnetic energy. "There's something else, Doctor," Solomon continued, bringing up a final image. "This thermal scan was taken during different seasons over a 3-year period. Look at how the temperature signatures in the voids change. The hidden chambers appeared to respond to external conditions, cooling during dry seasons and warming during periods of high humidity. More intriguingly, the temperature variations showed patterns that corresponded to the Nile's traditional flood cycle, even though the river had been controlled by dams for decades. It's as if these chambers are still responding to environmental changes," Dr. Solomon said, "as if whatever system they're part of is still partially functional." Marcus studied the data for several minutes, his theory crystallizing into something approaching certainty. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient power plant. It was a machine with components that were still sealed inside, still responding to the same environmental triggers that had activated it thousands of years ago. Dr. Solomon, hypothetically, if someone wanted to access these chambers using modern technology, how would they do it? She looked around the coffee shop nervously. Hypothetically? Millimeter wave radar could map the internal structure precisely. Microbore drilling could create access holes small enough to insert fibre optic cameras. With the right equipment, you could explore these spaces without causing significant structural damage to the pyramid. Marcus nodded, already calculating what such an expedition would cost and how it might be organised. But Dr. Solomon wasn't finished. "Dr. Chen, there's something you should know. I'm not the first person to detect these chambers, and I won't be the last. But every researcher who has tried to investigate them seriously has found their access restricted, their funding cut, or their careers redirected. The Egyptian government isn't trying to preserve the pyramid from damage. They're trying to preserve its secrets from discovery." As Marcus walked back through Cairo's bustling streets, he realized he was no longer conducting academic research. He was investigating a cover-up that had been maintained for decades, possibly longer. The question was no longer what the pyramid had been designed to do. It was why someone was so determined to prevent modern science from finding out. That night, Marcus returned to the pyramid alone. Hassan had arranged for him to have extended access, though the guide had seemed reluctant to leave him there as darkness settled over the Giza plateau. "Dr. Chen, the pyramid. She's different at night. You be careful, yes? Some knowledge, it comes with price." Now, sitting in absolute darkness in the king's chamber with his instruments powered down and his cell phone turned off, Marcus could feel what Hassan had meant. The vibrations he'd noticed on his first day weren't stronger at night. They were clearer, unmasked by the electromagnetic interference of modern technology and the subtle vibrations of daytime activity. The feeling was unmistakable now, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones around him. It reminded him of sitting in a car with a powerful subwoofer, feeling the bass notes resonating in his chest. Except this sensation seemed to penetrate deeper. affecting not just his body but his consciousness itself. Marcus had brought along a new piece of equipment, a sensitive electromagnetic field detector borrowed from Dr. Solomon's laboratory. In the complete darkness and electrical silence of the chamber, the device could register even the faintest electromagnetic activity. He switched it on and watched the display with growing amazement. The pyramid was generating electricity. Not much. The readings were measured in millivolts and microamps, but the output was consistent, rhythmic, and definitely real. The electromagnetic field strength varied in cycles that corresponded to the acoustic resonance he'd measured earlier. The entire structure was functioning as a low-level electrical generator, powered by forces he was only beginning to understand. Marcus activated his night vision camera and began recording, speaking in whispers to avoid disturbing whatever delicate processes he was observing. The electromagnetic readings are strongest near the northeast corner of the chamber, consistent with the acoustic anomalies I documented earlier. The field strength appears to correlate with lunar cycles. Tonight's readings are approximately 20% higher than last week's, coinciding with the new moon. He moved the detector around the chamber, mapping the electromagnetic field as he had mapped the acoustics. The patterns were complex but consistent, forming a three-dimensional matrix of electrical activity that encompassed the entire chamber. At the centre of the room, where the pharaoh's sarcophagus should have been, the electromagnetic field reached its peak intensity. But there was something else. As Marcus sat in the centre of the chamber, surrounded by the electrical field generated by 4,000 years of precisely engineered stone, he began to experience something unexpected: altered consciousness. It started as a subtle shift in perception, similar to the disorientation he'd felt at high altitude or during meditation. But as he remained motionless in the electromagnetic field, the sensation deepened. His thoughts became clearer, more focused, while his awareness of the chamber around him expanded. He could sense the massive weight of the pyramid above him, the underground chambers below, even the subtle movements of air through the shaft systems. Marcus realized that the 110 Hz acoustic resonance he'd measured wasn't accidental. It was the exact frequency that research had shown could induce theta brainwave states associated with deep meditation, enhanced creativity, and altered consciousness. Combined with the electromagnetic field, the King's Chamber functioned as a consciousness-altering device. But why? What purpose would ancient builders have had for creating a machine that could systematically alter human consciousness? As Marcus sat in the pyramid's electromagnetic embrace, understanding dawned on him like sunrise over the desert. The pyramid wasn't just a power plant, it was a communication device. The electrical energy it generated wasn't meant to power lights or machinery. It was designed to amplify and transmit human consciousness itself. The ancient Egyptians had built the ultimate meditation chamber, a place where human awareness could be enhanced, expanded, and potentially transmitted across vast distances. The precision engineering, the electromagnetic properties, the acoustic tuning, all of it served to create conditions where consciousness could transcend the normal limitations of the human brain. Marcus thought about the ancient Egyptian concepts of Ka and Ba, aspects of the human soul that could travel beyond the physical body. What if these weren't just religious beliefs, but actual descriptions of consciousness, projection experiences facilitated by the pyramid's technology? The implications were staggering. If ancient Egyptians had mastered consciousness projection, they could have explored distant lands without physical travel, communicated across vast distances without messengers, and perhaps even preserved knowledge in ways that transcended physical destruction. The pyramid might have been their internet, their telecommunications network, their method of backing up human consciousness itself. Marcus's instruments continued recording as his awareness expanded further. He could sense other presences in the chamber, not supernatural entities, but echoes of the thousands of people who had experienced altered states in this space over the millennia. The pyramid had been accumulating consciousness, storing it in some form that science didn't yet understand. As the hours passed, Marcus began to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The Great Pyramid wasn't just an ancient monument, it was a machine for expanding